41 years before the Voranth invasion reached the Core Concordance's inner systems, the Concordance's own governing assembly had voted, by a margin its own historical record still described as regrettably necessary, to expel humanity from core membership entirely, sever all trade and defense guarantees, and confine Earth's territory to the unregulated outer reaches, on the strength of evidence that implicated a human research vessel in the destruction of the Halvorn colony, an atrocity that killed just under 200,000 Core Concordance citizens, and that every surviving record at the time seemed, overwhelmingly, to confirm. High Chancellor Ilsa Devrin's predecessor had delivered the expulsion ruling personally. In a Concordance Assembly session, Ambassador Petra Simmons, then Earth's junior delegate, had attended and never fully recovered from attending. The evidence before this assembly, the ruling stated, leaves no reasonable doubt that Earth origin technology and personnel were directly responsible for the Halvorn atrocity. This assembly cannot, in good conscience, continue to extend core protections and privileges to a species capable of this act, regardless of any claim of innocence its delegation continues to offer. Simmons had offered that claim of innocence for 3 days before the vote, presenting every piece of exculpatory evidence Earth's own investigators had managed to compile in the crisis's brief and chaotic aftermath. None of it had been enough. The evidence implicating Earth recovered data fragments, damaged but apparently authenticated, from the colony's own final transmissions had simply been more complete, more immediate, and more emotionally overwhelming than anything Earth's delegation could offer in response within the narrow window the tribunal allowed. We are being asked to disprove evidence in 3 days that took the investigating body considerably longer than that to assemble, Simmons had told the assembly, in her final statement before the vote. I would ask this body to consider what kind of evidence assembles itself this cleanly, this quickly, against a single defendant, in the middle of a genuine tragedy nobody has had time to properly investigate. Nobody had considered it seriously enough to change the outcome. Earth's expulsion from the Core Concordance took effect within the week, and the following 4 decades reshaped humanity's entire relationship with the wider galaxy, cut off from core trade routes, core defense guarantees, and core diplomatic standing. Earth rebuilt itself in the outer reaches as a considerably more self-reliant, considerably more quietly capable power than the Concordance's own dismissive assumptions about an exiled, disgraced species ever accounted for. What neither the original tribunal nor the 4 decades of Concordance indifference that followed had ever discovered, because nobody with genuine authority had ever looked closely enough to find it, was that the recovered data fragments implicating Earth in the Halvorn atrocity had been fabricated or planted, in the crisis's opening hours, by an agent of a considerably more patient and considerably more dangerous power that had spent decades quietly working to isolate the Core Concordance from any potential ally capable of meaningfully strengthening its defenses against an invasion that power had, even then, already begun planning. That power called itself the Voranth. Nobody in the Core Concordance had taken their presence in the wider galaxy seriously enough, across 4 decades of complacent security built on the false comfort of Earth's absence, to notice how thoroughly that absence had been engineered. The Voranth invasion, when it finally came, arrived with none of the patient subtlety that had characterized decades of quiet manipulation. Overlord Kesh Malran's forces struck 7 Core Concordance systems simultaneously, a coordinated assault that Concordance intelligence, still operating on defense assumptions built during an era when Earth's own considerable capability had once factored into the Core's collective deterrent strength, found itself catastrophically unprepared to meet. High Chancellor Ilsa Devrin, presiding over an emergency Concordance session in the same assembly chamber where her predecessor had once delivered Earth's expulsion ruling, confronted a military reality her own defense staff described in terms that left no room for the institutional confidence 4 decades of assumed security had built. 7 systems struck simultaneously, her fleet marshal reported. Our combined defense fleet has been reduced by 40% in the invasion's opening week alone. At current attrition, we do not have the capacity to hold the Concordance's inner systems beyond another 6 weeks. What changed? Devrin asked. Our defense assessments, until this invasion, never identified the Voranth as a threat of this scale. The Fleet Marshal's answer carried an admission the Concordance's own leadership had spent 4 decades avoiding. Our defense planning always assumed a combined core capability that included Earth's own considerable fleet strength as part of our collective deterrent, he said. We removed that assumption 41 years ago and never fully replaced the capability it represented. I believe, Chancellor, that the Voranth understood exactly what removing Earth from our collective defense would eventually cost us, considerably better than we did. Devrin's own investigation, authorized within days of that admission and conducted with a thoroughness the original Halvorn tribunal had never applied to Earth's defense, uncovered within 2 weeks what 4 decades of complacent indifference had allowed to remain buried, forensic reanalysis of the original data fragments, using verification methods considerably more advanced than anything available at the time of the original tribunal, confirmed the fragments had been fabricated. Their authentication markers consistent with technology no Earth origin system had ever produced, but entirely consistent with known Voranth data manipulation techniques documented in the current invasion's own intelligence gathering. We expelled an entire species from core membership, Devrin told her own reconvened council, reviewing the reanalysis results in a silence that carried considerably more weight than any of the invasion's own military briefings had managed to produce, based on evidence fabricated by the exact power currently invading us. I do not know how this council intends to address that fact. I know we cannot continue pretending it isn't true. Devrin's formal message reached Earth's Terran Council 11 days into the invasion, transmitted with a candor that 4 decades of concordance silence had never once extended to Earth in the entire span of its exile. The evidence used to expel Earth from core membership has been confirmed fabricated, planted by Voranth agents as part of a deliberate campaign to isolate this concordance from your species' military capability ahead of the invasion currently underway, the message read. I make no claim that this admission repairs 4 decades of injustice. I am asking, on behalf of billions of Core Concordance citizens currently facing an invasion your species was deliberately removed from our collective defense specifically to enable, whether Earth is willing to respond. President Malik Torrin read the message to Earth's full council with a measured caution that reflected the genuine complexity of what Devrin's request actually asked of a species that had spent 4 decades rebuilding itself specifically because the Core Concordance had discarded it without ever once, across all that time, seriously questioning the evidence that justified doing so. They want our help, Councillor Devon Achabi said, reviewing the message with an anger he made no attempt to fully disguise. 41 years, Mr. President. 41 years of exile, built on evidence they never once genuinely investigated, and the first time they reach out to correct it isn't an apology. It's a request for military assistance, timed precisely to when they actually need something from us. Ambassador Petra Simmons, considerably older now than the junior delegate who had once argued Earth's innocence before an assembly that refused to listen, spoke with a weight her 4 decades of carrying that unresolved injustice had given her a particular authority to offer. I understand the anger, she said. I've carried a version of it myself for 41 years. I would ask this council to consider something else alongside it, though. We are not being asked whether the Concordance deserves our help. We are being told, finally and unambiguously, exactly who actually did this to us, and exactly what that power is currently doing to billions of people who never voted for the tribunal that expelled us, most of whom weren't even alive when it happened. I do not believe answering this call means forgiving what was done to us. I believe it means finally getting the chance to face the actual architects of what was done to us, instead of continuing to direct 41 years of justified anger at the people who were simply deceived by them. President Torrin's decision, delivered after a full day of council deliberation that carried more genuine weight than any military authorization Earth's government had issued in the years since its own quiet, self-reliant rebuilding began, reflected Simmons's own framing more than Achabi's. We are not answering this call because the Concordance has earned our forgiveness, he said. We are answering it because the Voranth spent 4 decades manipulating an entire galaxy's understanding of who we are, and I am not willing to let that manipulation stand unanswered simply because correcting it happens to also help the people who were too complacent to question it themselves. Admiral Solenne. Prepare the fleet. Admiral Kara Solenne had spent the better part of 2 decades commanding a fleet that Earth's own leadership had built, across the entirety of its exile, with a deliberate, unstated purpose that most of her own junior officers had never been told explicitly, but had come, over years of training and readiness exercises that never seemed to serve any immediate defensive need, to understand implicitly, a fleet built not merely for Earth's own defense, but for the day Earth might finally need to prove, to a galaxy that had discarded it without a fair hearing, exactly what 4 decades of quiet, resentful preparation had actually produced. 291 vessels, Solenne reported to Torrin, presenting the fleet's full deployable strength for the first time outside Earth's own classified defense planning. Considerably more than the Concordance's own diminished defense fleet, and built on technology 41 years of independent development, unconstrained by Core Concordance oversight, allowed us to refine considerably beyond what we were permitted to develop as core members. The fleet's arrival at the Core Concordance's contested frontier, 11 days after Torrin's authorization, produced a reaction among Concordance defense forces that Simmons, accompanying the fleet in her own diplomatic capacity, found herself watching with an emotion considerably more complicated than the simple vindication 4 decades of injustice might have led her to expect. They don't know whether to be relieved or afraid, she told Solenne, watching concordance sensor operators register the fleet's full scale for the first time. I don't think most of them remember what our fleet actually looked like before the expulsion. I don't think any of them expected this. Solenne's engagement with the Voranth forces holding the core system of Halvorn Reach, chosen deliberately, by Torrin's own explicit instruction, as the first target of Earth's return, given the system's name's own bitter historical resonance with the atrocity that had originally justified Earth's expulsion, unfolded with a precision that 4 decades of independent tactical development, entirely unconstrained by concordance doctrine, had refined considerably beyond anything the Voranth's own intelligence, still working from outdated assumptions about Earth's capability, had accounted for. Within the engagement's opening 2 hours, Solenne's fleet disabled or destroyed 41 Voranth vessels holding the system, at a cost of only 6 of her own committed ships, a ratio that Overlord Malrin, receiving the engagement's report at Voranth Central Command, found himself reviewing with a concern his own institutional confidence had not previously needed to accommodate. Earth's fleet capability exceeds every assessment our intelligence division compiled across the last 4 decades, Malrin's own tactical staff reported. Our original strategic calculation assumed their exile permanently reduced them to a manageable regional power. That assumption appears to have been catastrophically incorrect. Malrin's own calculation, upon receiving confirmation of Earth's true capability, extended beyond the immediate tactical crisis at Halvorn Reach into a considerably more existential concern for the entire decades-long Voranth strategy his own predecessor had originally designed. If Earth's return proved capable of not merely defending the Core Concordance but actively reversing the invasion's momentum, the truth of Voranth's fabricated evidence and decades-long manipulation campaign would inevitably reach a concordance now actively fighting alongside the very species it had wrongfully expelled, exposing a strategic operation considerably larger than the Halvorn atrocity alone. This is no longer simply a military crisis, Malrin told his own war council. If Earth's fleet remains intact and the concordance fully understands the extent of our involvement in their expulsion, we do not merely lose this invasion's tactical advantage. We lose every future strategic option this decades-long campaign was designed to preserve. I want the full invasion fleet redirected. Earth's forces, specifically, become our primary objective, before their success at Halvorn Reach can embolden further concordance cooperation with them. The Voranth main invasion fleet, 461 vessels, representing the overwhelming bulk of Malrin's committed invasion strength, redirected from its original 7-system assault toward a single, decisive confrontation with Solenne's returning Earth fleet, a commitment that stripped considerable pressure from the Concordance's own remaining defended systems but concentrated Voranth capability against the one power Malrin's own revised strategic assessment now recognized as the invasion's actual decisive threat. Solenne, monitoring the Voranth fleet's redirection with a clarity that 4 decades of independent tactical planning had prepared her fleet to recognize immediately, understood the confrontation's full stakes without requiring further explanation from Earth's own command structure. They're not treating this as a single engagement anymore, she told her own senior staff. They understand what we actually represent now. This is no longer about retaking Halvorn Reach. This is about whether the power that spent 4 decades erasing us from the Core Concordance's defense gets to finish what that erasure was always meant to accomplish. Devrin's own contribution to the coming engagement, authorized within hours of Malrin's redirection becoming apparent to Concordance intelligence, reflected a Core Concordance leadership finally, belatedly willing to commit its own remaining strength alongside the species it had wrongfully discarded. Our remaining defense fleet stands ready to support Admiral Solenne's forces, she told Torrin directly, in a communication that carried none of the careful diplomatic distance her original request for assistance had maintained. I understand this offer arrives considerably too late to undo 41 years of injustice. I am offering it regardless, because I believe this concordance owes your species considerably more than a request for help, and standing beside you against the power that engineered our estrangement is the only meaningful correction currently within my authority to offer. The engagement that followed, fought across the contested frontier system of Voss's Reach, brought Solenne's 285 remaining Earth vessels, reinforced by Devrin's own committed concordance fleet of 141 ships, against Malrin's full 461-vessel invasion force in a confrontation that both sides understood, from its opening exchange, would decisively determine considerably more than the immediate tactical outcome of a single battle. Malrin's own tactical doctrine, built across decades of patient, indirect manipulation rather than genuine large-scale fleet engagement, proved considerably less adaptable under the sustained pressure of direct, coordinated combat than his own numerical advantage should have guaranteed. Solenne's fleet, employing tactical architecture refined across 4 decades of independent development specifically unconstrained by the doctrinal assumptions the Voranth's own intelligence had used to plan the engagement, began systematically dismantling Malren's formation within the battle's opening 90 minutes, targeting command coordination nodes with a precision that fragmented the invasion fleet's ability to respond as a unified force considerably faster than its own raw numbers should have allowed. Devrin's Concordance forces, fighting alongside Earth's fleet for the first time in over 4 decades, provided a coordinated flanking pressure that closed off Malren's own withdrawal corridors as the engagement's momentum shifted decisively against the Voranth formation. "They're not going to be able to disengage," Solenne's own tactical officer reported, 3 hours into the sustained engagement, watching Malren's own remaining formation collapse under coordinated pressure from both directions. "Their withdrawal routes are fully compromised. If they continue committing rather than surrendering, this engagement ends with the entire invasion fleet destroyed." Malren, aboard his own flagship in the engagement's final hour, received a direct hail from Admiral Solenne offering terms his own decades-long strategic calculation had never once considered a genuine possibility: surrender, with formal accountability before the Core Concordance for the fabricated evidence and decades of manipulation that had originally engineered Earth's expulsion. "Overlord Malren," Solenne's transmission read, "your fleet's position is untenable. I am offering surrender terms that include formal accountability for the Halvorn fabrication and everything that campaign made possible. I would strongly recommend you consider them." Malren's answer, delivered not through diplomatic channel but through a final, full commitment of his own remaining forces against Solenne's flagship directly, reflected a calculation his own decades of patient strategy could not survive abandoning: that formal accountability for a campaign this extensive would end his own authority, and likely his life, considerably more certainly than continuing to fight a battle his own tactical staff had already confirmed was lost. The engagement's final hour, fought without further offer of terms once Malren's own commitment made clear no surrender would be accepted from his own command, ended with the complete destruction of the Voranth invasion fleet's command structure and the overwhelming majority of its committed vessels. Of the 461 ships Malren had committed to the engagement, none survived the battle's conclusion with functional command authority intact, and Malren's own flagship, the final vessel to fall, carried no survivors from its command crew. No one who had orchestrated the fabrication that exiled an entire species, and the decades-long campaign that fabrication had been designed to enable, survived to answer for it in the formal accountability process Solenne had offered and Malren had refused. News of Voss's reached the full Core Concordance within days, carried alongside the complete forensic record Devrin's own investigation had compiled, confirming beyond any remaining institutional doubt the fabrication that had originally justified Earth's expulsion and the decades of manipulation that fabrication had enabled. The formal concordance session convened to address the finding, the first session in over 4 decades where Earth's own delegation held a recognized seat, produced a reckoning considerably more complete than Devrin's original request for assistance had ever explicitly promised. The original expulsion ruling was formally vacated. Earth's core membership was reinstated, alongside a formal concordance acknowledgement, entered into the permanent historical record, that the tribunal responsible for the original ruling had failed catastrophically in its basic obligation to investigate evidence it should never have accepted as thoroughly conclusive as it had been presented. Ambassador Simmons, addressing the same assembly chamber where she had once argued Earth's innocence to a body that refused to listen, delivered a statement considerably more measured than the vindication the moment might have justified. "I do not believe this session's ruling repairs 41 years, she told the assembled delegates. "I do not believe any ruling could. What I believe it does, and what I would ask this body to hold on to considerably more carefully than it held on to its original judgment, is confirm that evidence assembled quickly, cleanly, and conveniently against a single defendant, in the middle of genuine tragedy, deserves considerably more scrutiny than this body was willing to give it the first time. I would ask you to remember what that failure cost, and I would ask you to make certain it is never repeated against anyone else standing where we once stood." President Torrin's own formal response to the Concordance's reinstatement offer reflected a caution that 4 decades of hard-won independence had taught Earth's own leadership to carry into any renewed relationship with an institution that had once discarded it so completely. "Earth accepts reinstated core membership," he said, "not because we require this Concordance's protection or standing to continue thriving, but because a concordance that has genuinely reckoned with its own failure deserves the chance to demonstrate it has actually changed. We will be watching considerably more carefully than we once did." 3 weeks after Voss's reach, Admiral Solenne walked through the primary staging bay of her own flagship, its crew standing down from active engagement footing for the first time since Earth's return began, the ship's hull bearing the accumulated marks of an engagement that had, in a single decisive battle, both vindicated 4 decades of preparation and ended, permanently, Any possibility of formal accountability from the man most directly responsible for the injustice that preparation had answered. Ambassador Simmons found her there, considerably older than the junior delegate who had once argued before an unlistening tribunal, carrying a weight in her own bearing that the Concordance's formal reinstatement had not fully lifted. "We got the ruling reversed," Simmons said. "The record corrected. Full core membership restored, 41 years later." She paused. "I don't feel as much relief in that as I expected to feel, watching it happen." "I don't think either of us was ever really fighting for the ruling," Solenne said. "I think we were fighting to make sure the people who actually did this to us couldn't keep doing it to anyone else. We got that. I'm not sure it was ever going to feel like triumph, even when we did." Simmons considered that for a long moment. "No," she finally said. "I don't think it was. I think it was always just going to feel like something finally being true, after 41 years of it not being allowed to be." President Torrin, reviewing the Concordance's full reinstatement documentation in Earth's own command facility, found himself considering a question he suspected would occupy Earth's own historical reckoning with this moment considerably longer than the military campaign itself had lasted. "We answered a call from people who wronged us," he told his own senior staff, "and we ended it by making sure the actual architects of that wrong didn't survive to do it again. I don't know if that's justice, exactly. I know it's the closest thing to it that 41 years of waiting ever actually offered us." In Earth's own reopened Core Concordance archive, a records officer filed the final entry closing the Halvorn expulsion case, a file that had sat open, unresolved, and largely ignored for over 4 decades before a single week's fighting finally forced its resolution. The Halvorn Tribunal's original ruling is vacated in full. The evidence that justified it was fabricated by the power responsible for the atrocity it was meant to explain, deployed specifically to isolate this concordance from an ally that same power correctly understood as its greatest future obstacle. That power's invasion force, and the command structure that orchestrated 4 decades of manipulation to enable it, did not survive Earth's return. This record does not celebrate that outcome. It simply confirms that a truth withheld for 41 years finally arrived, and that the cost of withholding it that long was paid, in the end, by the ones who withheld it, not by the ones who spent 4 decades waiting to be believed. No one ever revised it.